Hello YouTube, welcome. This is part 3 of a series of videos about Anthony Riley's recent challenge, which is in this video, Flat Earth New Moon Challenge. Anthony is challenging people to show that the new moon actually exists. And it's a totally dishonest challenge because the new moon cannot be seen from the Earth because it's always in the same part of the sky, very close to the sun. It's not close physically to the sun, but it's in the same part of the sky as the sun. And so there's lots of sunlight coming towards the Earth. None of that sunlight is being reflected to the Earth from the moon because the moon is presenting a completely dark surface, the side not lit by the moon, by the sun, to the Earth, so you can't see the moon, and you can't photograph any Earth shine, which is the main sort of point of his challenge, because there is too much light from the sun, and it completely will overwhelm any detector that you point at the moon, be it a camera or some more sophisticated equipment. It's possible that some clever scientist somewhere actually would be able to detect and establish the moon's presence, but I haven't located yet any evidence that they have, and I can't imagine why they would actually want to bother. They're not remotely interested in Anthony Riley's challenge. However, as part of this challenge video, Anthony makes some interesting assertions, not least that he thinks the moon travels behind the sun at new moon. And I already published 2 videos, one challenging the evidence, that so-called evidence that he bases that upon, and the second one showing that at least at some times the moon is most definitely closer to the Earth than the sun is to the Earth, and therefore for the moon to travel behind the sun, the moon would have to change in its position relative to the Earth and go behind the sun. And the question then sort of emerged in my head: how do we know that the moon is in fact the distance away from the Earth that is claimed? And I've posted a link to this PDF document. One way is Parallax, and this document is quite good for the sort of lay person, sort of non-scientist. It explains in very clear terms what parallax is, a bit of historical background, and how the calculations are done, and then it explains lunar parallax and how we can measure it and how it has been measured. So the idea in diagrammatic form is to take 2 photographs from different locations on the Earth at the same time. It's not the same, 5 o'clock in the afternoon in one place and 5 o'clock in the afternoon in another place. It's the same actual time. So at the same moment, these photographs are taken. And first photograph shows 2 stars and the moon. Well, the diagram here shows 2 stars and the moon. The second one, the same 2 stars would be in place because they'd be in the same location relative to the Earth. The moon is seen to be in a different place, and this is due relative to these stars. This is due to parallax. And if you superimpose one picture on top of the other, you would have something like this. And using this distance between the locations of the moon, lining up the stars, or lining up the moon and seeing the difference in the relative locations of the stars, you can make some calculations. Using some fairly straightforward trigonometry, you can calculate, or using the pictures, you can measure and know what this angle is. You know the location, the different distance between locations A and B where the photographs were taken, and using that knowledge, you're able to determine the lengths of these lines, the length of distance between location A and the moon and location B and the moon, or both. The trigonometry is not complicated. It's pretty simple stuff. Most high school kids can do it without much trouble. And there are some examples of actual photographs taken as part of a lunar parallax demonstration project. So one taken in Brussels and another one taken in Essex. And when you superimpose those pictures, getting the stars perfectly lined up, you see there's a difference in the position of the moon. And the same with in USA and Europe, Colorado here, and the same picture from Essex. And when you superimpose those, there's a bigger distance because there's a bigger distance between the two locations on Earth. So using this method, it's possible to calculate the distance to the moon, and it comes out as varying because the moon's orbit is an ellipse, not a circle. But it's always between 350,000 kilometers and about 405,000 kilometers. And that's one way to calculate the distance to the moon. And another way is to use radar. And this was done back in the 60s, and in fact has been used to calculate the distances to various planets in the solar system. I think Pluto hasn't been done. It's now designated a dwarf planet. But the others, as far as I'm aware, distance has been calculated, and certainly it's been done for the moon. And the moon comes out at 385,000 kilometers in this particular experiment, or set of experiments that were done to measure that distance. This may be a mean distance. I think it's a mean distance that they got, which is about right for the, pretty accurate for the mean distance as far as we can tell from the parallax measurements and other measurements. Most accurate method is to use laser ranging. So the Apollo mission left a solar reflector. In fact, I think there are 3 solar reflectors from 11, 14 and 15, according to this article. And by firing a laser from the Earth to the moon aimed at these reflectors, you can then, because they reflect the light back along similar path to the path that the light comes in, the laser light is reflected back to Earth, and by measuring the time it takes for the light to make the full distance to the moon and back, and using the known speed of light, you can calculate the distance traveled. And using this method, we've been able to measure the distance to the moon with an accuracy of about 3 centimeters, the average distance coming out of 385,000 kilometers. And we've also been able to establish that the moon is in fact receding from the Earth at about 3.8 centimeters per year. So the distance to the moon is very accurately known, and it's known to be have an average distance of 385,000 kilometers. The variations in the measured distance are explained by the orbit being an ellipse and not being an ellipse that's perfectly centered upon the Earth, and the appearance of the moon, the apparent size of the moon in the sky observed from the Earth changes, and those changes match exactly the expected change with a change in distance for the orbit. So when the moon is at its furthest point from the Earth, it appears smaller in the sky, and when it's according to the orbit calculations at its closest point to the Earth, it appears larger in the sky. And this is why we had the recent supermoon, because it was at its closest point to the Earth and therefore appeared larger in the sky. It also happened to be quite low in the sky at a time when people can notice it, and so you get this supermoon at harvest moon time, which is quite spectacular to observe. But the occurrence is entirely in keeping with all the measurements, all the calculations that have been made. Now, Antony's challenge is connected with his assertion that the moon is not a solid object. It's not something that it's possible to land rockets on. And if he's going to make this assertion, then he must assert that the laser reflectors are not actually on the moon because the Apollo astronauts left them there. And so all these calculations and the suggestion that the moon is receding from the Earth at 3.8 centimeters per year and so on are completely bogus. And he must assert that every lunar mission that has landed on the moon or even orbited the moon, based on calculations using the distance to the moon and the known orbit of the moon and so on, he must assert that all of those are fake. If we go to Wikipedia, Wikipedia has, okay, Wikipedia is flawed, but all of these facts can be checked. Please go ahead and check them and point out any that are wrong. It has a list of missions to the moon to date. Now, going back to 1958, and the first several had launch failures. There was a partial failure, and not until 1959 did the Russians have some success with a spacecraft impacting on the moon and another doing a flyby. We have some continued failures by Russian and American NASA missions until 1964, when we have 2 American impacts on the moon and a third one in 65. There's a flyby by a Russian mission which was successful, a lander in 1966, Luna 9, which landed on the moon, another orbiter from Russia and American that landed on the moon, Surveyor 1, some more failures, which are entirely to be expected. The technology of rockets and space travel was being developed during the early and mid-60s, and they had many errors. Far more successes starting to appear, so we have more orbiters and landers. Another failure or 2, more orbiters and landers landing on the moon. Another lander, here we are in 1967, landers on the moon, the Surveyor 7, the Surveyor 6. A few more failures, mostly by the Russians at around about this time. A flyby and a manned orbiter. So this is the first manned mission to the moon, which orbited the moon, Apollo 8, and returned with some stunning photographs as well. Apollo 10 was another manned orbiter. Apollo 11 actually landed on the moon. Another flyby by the Russians. Another Apollo mission. A Russian mission which returned samples, so presumably landed and then returned samples. Another flyby, another lander stroke rover on the moon from the Russians, manned orbiters for the Apollo mission, and so on, and so on. More successes as the technology improves, and literally dozens and dozens of successful missions landing on the moon or orbiting the moon, all based on the distance of 385,000 kilometers and the known orbit and speed of the moon, and bringing back samples of a solid moon. And not only Russian and Americans, but also more recently the Europeans, the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Indians. The whole the whole lot has to be completely faked if Anthony Riley is correct. So Anthony, what is your evidence that any of these missions were in fact faked? What is your evidence that the data from them was all faked, and why were so many missions planned and ended in launch failures? Why would you plan a fake mission and have it end in a launch failure? whilst others end in success. Look forward to your reply, Anthony. That's where I'm going to end this particular Hangout and this particular live transmission. So there will be parts 4 and maybe 5 a little later on.